The Republicans are continuing their attack against the working families of our country with one of the most destructive budgets in American history. And I know the American people today, for very good reasons, are preoccupied with the horror of what happened in Las Vegas, and people are horrified by what has happened in Puerto Rico. But I would beg of the American people, please pay attention to the budget proposal and the so-called tax reform ideas brought by the Republican leadership here in the Senate as well as in the House. This proposal would cause devastating economic pain for tens of millions of Americans by, on one hand, giving incredibly large tax breaks for the wealthiest people in the country, while at the same time making it harder for our children to get a decent education, harder for the families of this country to get the health care they need, harder for families to literally put food on the table, harder to protect our environment, and harder for the elderly to live their retirement years with dignity. Mr. President, this is the Robin Hood proposal in reverse, the Robin Hood principle in reverse. Instead of taking from the rich to help the poor, this proposal makes massive cuts in programs desperately needed by the middle class and working families of our country, precisely to give unbelievably large tax breaks to the people on top, the people who least need those tax breaks. Mr. President, at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, where we have more inequality today than in any time since the 1920s, and more inequality than almost any major country on earth, where the very, very rich are becoming much richer. We have 40 million people living in poverty, and tens of millions of middle-class families are going nowhere in a hurry. This Republican budget, according to the Tax Policy Center, at the end of 10 years would provide 80% of the tax benefits to the top 1%. Right now, today, the very rich are doing phenomenally well. Everybody understands that. Middle class is shrinking. But according to the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center, by the end of the decade, nearly 80% of the tax benefits of the Republican plan would go to the top 1%. Under this plan, this Republican plan, the top 1/10 of 1%, this is the richest of the rich, would receive a tax break of over $1 million a year. At a time when so many of our families are struggling to put food on the table, struggling to figure out how they're going to send their kids to college, struggling about how they're going to afford to pay for child care, we have a Republican tax proposal which provides trillions of dollars in tax breaks to the richest people in this country. Mr. President, this is a budget which would increase the federal deficit by $1.5 trillion over the next decade. Now, we have heard here on the Senate floor my Republican friends talking about how worried they are about the $20 trillion national debt we have, how high the deficits are. This proposal, designed to give tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country, would increase the federal deficit by $1.5 trillion over the next decade. And by the way, that is a conservative estimate. There are those who, in fact, think the deficit would go up a lot more than that. This is a Republican proposal which eliminates the estate tax. Now, what is the estate tax? Republicans name it the death tax. But let us be clear, about what this tax is and who benefits from it. Despite Republican efforts trying to find farmers or ranchers who would benefit from it, this is not legislation designed to help farmers or ranchers. This is legislation designed to help the top 0.2%. 99.8% of the American people would not benefit one nickel from the repeal of the estate tax. Only the wealthiest of the wealthy. If this Republican proposal to repeal the estate tax would go through, the Walton family of Walmart, the wealthiest family in America, would receive a tax cut of up to $52 billion. Does anybody for 1 second think that at a time when so many of our people are struggling, when we have a $20 trillion national debt, that we should be passing legislation that gives the wealthiest family in this country up to a $52 billion tax break by repealing the estate tax? But it's not just the Walton family, of course. This is a budget that says that if you are the second wealthiest family in America, the Koch brothers, and this, by the way, just coincidentally, no doubt, I know it's amazing how these coincidences take place, Koch brothers are a family that has contributed hundreds of millions of dollars year after year to the Republican Party to elect candidates who will represent the wealthy and the powerful. Well, just coincidentally, that family would receive a tax break of up to $38 billion. So people say, well, why is the Koch brothers, why are they contributing hundreds of millions of dollars every campaign cycle? That's a huge amount of money. Yeah, it is a huge amount of money for normal families. But when you're the second wealthiest family and your family can get a tax break of $38 billion, contributing a few $100 million every campaign cycle is pocket change. It's a good investment. Mr. President, this is a budget that will cut Medicare by $450 billion. Now, right now in this country, we have millions and millions of seniors who are struggling to make ends meet. They can't afford their prescription drugs, can't afford to keep their homes warm in the wintertime, and yet this budget, Republican budget, would cut Medicare by $450 billion. Now, the Republicans tried time after time after time, despite massive opposition from the American people, to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And in every one of their pieces of legislation, they made devastating cuts in Medicaid. Well, they're back again. Ostensibly, this is not a health care piece of legislation. It is a budget. It is so-called tax reform. There is $1 trillion in cuts in the Medicaid program. So if you were worried last week and 2 weeks ago and a month ago what these horrific Republican health care bills would do, stay worried, because this bill will cut $1 trillion over 10 years in Medicaid, resulting in at least 15 million Americans losing their health insurance. Can you imagine a set of priorities which says we're going to throw 15 million people off of health insurance in order to give tens of billions of dollars in tax breaks to the wealthiest families in this country? Unbelievable. It really is unbelievable. But this proposal not only adds to the deficit, not only makes massive cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, it also impacts the American people in many, many ways. We have a program in this country called the Women, Infants, and Children Program. And at a time when the United States has the highest rate of infant mortality of any major country on earth, What we do to try to deal with that issue is provide help to low-income pregnant women and their babies after the babies are born. This Republican budget would make about $6.5 billion in cuts to the WIC program, eliminating nutrition assistance to over 1.2 million pregnant women, new moms, babies, and toddlers in Vermont and all over this country. Here are the priorities: tax breaks for the Walton family, for the Koch brothers family, for billionaires, and cuts in programs for low-income pregnant women who want to have healthy babies. At a time when the cost of child care has skyrocketed all over this country, the state of Vermont, very serious problem. Families cannot find affordable child care. The Republican budget eliminates Head Start services for 25,000 children each and every year by cutting this program by about $3 billion. In total, the Republican budget would cut more than $5 trillion from education, health care, affordable housing, child care, transportation, and other programs that the working families of this country desperately rely upon. And let's be clear about something else. This is not me talking. This is Republican economists saying the same thing. What is the theory underlying this whole approach of giving tax breaks to billionaires? The theory is that when you give tax breaks to billionaires and large multinational corporations, somehow or another they're going to start using the new revenue they acquire to invest in the economy and create decent-paying jobs. This is the so-called trickle-down economic theory. And this is a theory that Senate Republicans and President Trump have embraced with this budget. But the fact is that anyone who looks at history understands that that whole theory is a fraud. It has always been an abysmal failure. Since Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush slashed taxes on the wealthy and deregulated Wall Street, trillions of dollars in wealth have been redistributed from the middle class and working families to a handful of millionaires and billionaires. That's what trickle-down economics results in: transfer of wealth from the middle class to the people on top, and that is exactly what this Republican proposal will do. Mr. President, today we have more wealth and inequality than at any time since the 1920s. Unbelievably, the top 0.1% now owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. This budget would make a very bad situation worse, and it would increase the level of wealth inequality in America today. As the ranking member of the Budget Committee, I intend to do everything that I can to oppose this absurd set of priorities. And when I do that, I am speaking for the vast majority of the American people. Poll after poll after poll tells us that the American people do not think that billionaires need more tax breaks. Poll after poll after poll tells us that the American people do not agree with the Republican leadership when they want to throw millions of people off of the health insurance that they have. This is a budget not for the American people. This is a budget not for economic growth. This is a budget paid for, fought for by the Koch brothers and a handful of billionaires who will gain very handsomely if this budget were to be passed. And I would remind my Republican colleagues, and this is not a very radical idea, that we were elected to the United States Senate not just to represent a handful of billionaires. We were represented to the United States Senate to do our best for the middle class and working families of our country. This should not be legislation designed as payback for hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign contributions. We need to pass legislation that protects the interests of the working families and the middle class and lower income people. Thank you, Mr. President.